in the heart of West Africa, where the Niger River bends like a serpent through golden sands, there once stood an empire so vast, so powerful, that its wealth made European monarchs seem like paupers. Its armies were disciplined and feared. Its scholars were revered across continents. Its cities glittered with gold, knowledge, and commerce. This was Songhai, the greatest empire West Africa has ever known. Yet today, its name barely echoes in the halls of global history, erased by time, colonialism, and the selective memory of those who wrote the narratives. But the story of Songhai is not just a tale of conquest and wealth. It is a story of vision, strategy, brilliance, and ultimately, betrayal. It is a story that deserves to be remembered, celebrated, and understood in all its epic complexity. If you enjoy exploring powerful stories like this, make sure to subscribe for more African history content. Long before Europeans set foot on African soil with their maps and misconceptions, long before the slave trade would reshape the continent's destiny, West Africa was home to sophisticated civilizations that rivaled anything in medieval Europe or Asia. The Ghana Empire had risen and fallen. The Mali Empire, under Mansa Musa, had dazzled the world with its legendary wealth. But it was Songhai that would emerge from Mali's shadow to become the true superpower of the Sahel, controlling an empire that stretched across 2,000 miles, from the Atlantic forests to the salt mines of the Sahara, from the goldfields of Bambouk to the trading posts of Air. The story begins not with a sudden conquest, but with centuries of patient growth. The Songhai people had lived along the Niger River for generations, their origins shrouded in the mists of time. They were fishermen, farmers, traders who understood the rhythm of the great river that gave them life. Their capital, Gao, sat strategically on Niger's eastern bend, a crossroads where desert caravans met river commerce, where Arab merchants from the north traded with African merchants from the south. Gold, salt, ivory, slaves, cloth, and knowledge flowed through Gao's markets like water through the Niger itself. But for centuries, the Songhai remained subordinate. First to the Ghana Empire, then to the mighty Mali Empire under its Mandinka kings. The Songhai paid tribute, bent the knee, and waited. They watched as Mali grew fat and complacent, as its emperors lost control of distant provinces, as internal conflicts weakened the once mighty empire. The Songhai kings in Gao, paying tribute with gritted teeth, understood something fundamental about power. It is not permanent, it is not inherited, it must be seized. And when the moment came, they were ready. The transformation of Songhai from tributary state to empire did not happen overnight. It required vision, military genius, and the right leader at the right moment. That leader would emerge in the form of Sunni Ali, a warrior king whose name would become legend, whose conquests would lay the foundation for Songhai's golden age, and whose methods would inspire both admiration and fear. Sunni Ali came to power in 1464, inheriting a kingdom that was still technically subordinate to Mali, but already flexing its muscles. He inherited a legacy of resistance, for his father and grandfather had already begun the process of breaking away from Malian control. But Sunni Ali was different. He was not content with independence. He wanted an empire. He wanted to replace Mali, not just escape it. And he had the vision, the ruthlessness, and the military genius to make it happen. The first test came immediately. Timbuktu, the jewel of the Sahel, the city of scholars and gold, had been seized by Tuareg raiders from the desert. These Berber nomads, fierce warriors mounted on swift camels, had taken advantage of Mali's weakness to claim one of West Africa's greatest prizes. Timbuktu was more than just a city. It was a symbol of power, learning, and wealth. Whoever controlled Timbuktu controlled the trans-Saharan trade routes. Whoever controlled Timbuktu could claim legitimacy as the true power in West Africa. Sunni Ali moved with a speed that caught everyone off guard. His armies, trained and disciplined, marched on Timbuktu with the force of a desert storm. The Tuareg, expecting a prolonged siege or negotiation, were overwhelmed by the ferocity and organization of the Songhai military. In 1468, just 4 years into his reign, Sunni Ali entered Timbuktu as its conqueror. But his treatment of the city would define his reputation for generations. The scholars of Timbuktu, proud and privileged under Malian rule, expected to be treated with the deference they felt they deserved. They were the intellectual elite, the custodians of Islamic learning, the teachers who attracted students from as far away as Egypt and Arabia. But Sunni Ali saw them differently. To him, they were potential threats, elites who might plot against him, who might question his authority, who might prefer the old Malian order to his new Songhai Empire. His response was brutal and calculated. He executed scholars, confiscated property, and made it clear that in his empire, military power trumped intellectual prestige. This ruthlessness was not mere cruelty, it was a strategy. Sunni Ali understood that building an empire required more than military conquest. It required breaking the power structures that might resist centralized authority. It required sending a message that the old order was dead and that loyalty to Songhai was not optional. The scholars of Timbuktu, horrified and humiliated, would remember Sunni Ali as a tyrant. But they would also remember him as the man who could not be defied. From Timbuktu, Sunni Ali turned his gaze to the next prize. Jenne, another great trading city, another symbol of power and wealth. Jenne was different from Timbuktu. Where Timbuktu was a desert city, accessible to caravans and cavalry, Jenne was a river city, surrounded by the Niger's floodplains, protected by water and marshland. Taking Jenne would require different tactics, different thinking. It would require patience. Sunni Ali laid siege to Jenne, but this was no ordinary siege. He understood the rhythms of the Niger, the seasonal floods that transformed the landscape. He used his navy, a fleet of war canoes manned by skilled Songhai boatmen who knew every channel and current of the great river. He cut off Jenne's supply routes, isolated it from the outside world, and waited. For 7 years, the siege continued. 7 years of pressure, of gradual strangulation, of psychological warfare. The people of Jenne, proud and defiant, held out longer than anyone expected. But eventually, inevitably, the city fell. When Sunni Ali entered Jenne in 1473, he had proven something crucial, that Songhai could take any city, no matter how well defended, no matter how strategically positioned. He had proven that he commanded not just cavalry and infantry, but naval forces capable of projecting power along Niger's vast network of waterways. This was military innovation on a grand scale, adapting tactics to terrain, using the environment as a weapon. But Sunni Ali's conquests were about more than adding territories to a map. They were about controlling commerce, the lifeblood of any empire. The Niger River was West Africa's highway, connecting communities across thousands of miles. The trans-Saharan trade routes brought gold from the south to the Mediterranean world, brought salt and copper from the Sahara to the forests. Whoever controlled these routes controlled wealth. Whoever controlled wealth controlled power. And Sunni Ali understood this with crystal clarity. His military campaigns were surgical in their strategic thinking. He did not conquer randomly. He targeted cities and regions that gave him control over trade networks. He secured the Niger River's key points. He pushed into the Sahel and the edges of the Sahara, bringing the salt-producing regions under Songhai control. He moved south into the gold-producing regions, ensuring that the precious metal flowed through his empire. By the time of his death in 1492, Sunni Ali had transformed Songhai from a regional kingdom into West Africa's dominant power. But his legacy was complicated. To his supporters, he was a military genius, a visionary who built an empire through brilliance and will. To the Muslim scholars and clerics who wielded enormous influence in West African society, he was a tyrant, a man whose commitment to Islam was questionable, whose brutality toward the learned classes was unforgivable. This tension between military power and religious legitimacy would define Songhai politics for decades to come. When Sunni Ali died, drowned in a river under mysterious circumstances that some whispered was assassination, the empire he built faced an immediate crisis. His son, Sunni Baru, inherited the throne but not the power. Within months, one of Sunni Ali's most capable generals, Muhammad Toure, staged a coup. This was not just a military takeover, it was a revolution, a fundamental reshaping of Songhai's identity and ideology. Muhammad Toure was everything Sunni Ali was not. Where Sunni Ali was a warrior first, Muhammad was a devout Muslim. Where Sunni Ali antagonized the scholarly class, Muhammad courted them. Where Sunni Ali's legitimacy came from conquest, Muhammad sought legitimacy through Islam, through pilgrimage, through connection to the broader Muslim world. He would take the title Askia, meaning usurper, or general, turning an insult into a badge of honor. He would become Askia Muhammad, and under his rule, Songhai would reach its zenith. Askia Muhammad understood that military might alone could not sustain an empire. He needed administration, infrastructure, legitimacy, and ideology. He set about creating all of these with the same systematic brilliance that Sunni Ali had applied to warfare. First, he consolidated power through a combination of military campaigns and political marriages, alliances, and appointments. He divided the empire into provinces, each governed by officials responsible directly to him. He created a standing army, a professional military force that was paid and equipped by the state, loyal to the throne rather than to individual commanders or ethnic groups. This administrative structure was sophisticated and effective. Provinces were overseen by governors who collected taxes, maintained order, and adjudicated disputes. Below them were local chiefs who handled day-to-day governance. Above them was the central court in Gao, where Askia Muhammad presided over a council of ministers responsible for different aspects of imperial administration: finance, military affairs, justice, and trade. This was not tribal governance or feudal chaos. This was bureaucracy, imperial administration on a scale that rivaled contemporary European kingdoms. But Askia Muhammad's masterstroke was his pilgrimage to Mecca. In 1500, just 8 years into his reign, he embarked on the Hajj, the pilgrimage every Muslim is called to make. This was not a simple journey. It was a diplomatic and propaganda triumph, a statement of intent that reverberated across the Muslim world. Askia Muhammad traveled with an entourage of thousands, with scholars, soldiers, servants, and slaves. He brought gold, vast quantities of gold, which he distributed with calculated generosity along the route. The pilgrimage was a declaration that Songhai was not some peripheral African kingdom, but a major Islamic state, a player on the world stage. When Askia Muhammad met with scholars in Cairo, when he consulted with religious authorities in Mecca, when he was recognized and honored by the Sharif of Mecca himself, he gained something invaluable: legitimacy. He returned to Songhai not just as a successful general who had seized power, but as a pilgrim king, blessed by the holiest authorities in Islam, a ruler whose right to rule was sanctified by religion. This legitimacy allowed him to do what Sunni Ali could not: win over the scholarly class, the Islamic clerics and judges who wielded enormous social and cultural influence in West African cities. Askia Muhammad showered patronage on scholars, built mosques and madrasas, supported Islamic education, and positioned himself as the defender of the faith. Timbuktu, which had suffered under Sunni Ali, flourished under Askia Muhammad. The city became a beacon of Islamic learning, home to the famous Sankore Madrasa, where scholars studied law, theology, astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. The University of Sankore was not a provincial backwater. It was a world-class institution, attracting students and scholars from across the Muslim world. Its libraries held hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, treatises on everything from Islamic jurisprudence to astronomical calculations, from medical texts to philosophical debates. The scholars of Timbuktu corresponded with intellectuals in Cairo, Baghdad, and Morocco. They were part of a global intellectual community, contributing to and drawing from the vast reservoir of Islamic knowledge that stretched from Spain to India. This golden age of learning was not separate from Songhai's political and economic power. It was integral to it. Educated bureaucrats staffed the imperial administration. Islamic law provided a framework for commerce and justice that transcended ethnic and linguistic boundaries. The reputation of Songhai scholars enhanced the empire's prestige and attracted merchants and diplomats from distant lands. Knowledge and power reinforced each other, creating a civilization that was both militarily formidable and intellectually sophisticated. But an empire is not built on learning alone. It requires wealth, and Songhai had wealth in abundance. The empire's economy was complex and diverse, based on agriculture, trade, and tribute. Along the Niger River, farmers cultivated millet, rice, and sorghum, producing surpluses that fed the cities and armies. Fishermen harvested the river's bounty. Herders raised cattle, sheep, and goats. This agricultural base supported a population of millions, provided food security, and generated tax revenue. But the real wealth came from trade. Songhai sat at the intersection of multiple trade networks. From the south came gold, the precious metal that made West African kingdoms legendary. From the Sahara came salt, essential for preserving food and sustaining life in the tropics, so valuable that it was sometimes traded weight for weight with gold. From the Mediterranean came textiles, weapons, paper, and manufactured goods. From the east came horses, crucial for cavalry warfare. From the forest regions came kola nuts, ivory, and slaves. The cities of Songhai were cosmopolitan entrepôts, where merchants from dozens of different ethnic groups and regions conducted business. In Timbuktu's markets, Berber traders from the Sahara haggled with Dioula merchants from the forest zone. Arab traders from North Africa did business with Hausa merchants from the east. Songhai's government facilitated this commerce through standardized weights and measures, through enforcement of contracts, through security along trade routes. The empire grew rich on taxes levied on this trade, on customs duties collected at major cities, on tribute paid by conquered territories. Askia Muhammad expanded the empire systematically, adding new territories that brought strategic or economic benefits. He campaigned in the Sahara, bringing the important salt-producing town of Tagaza under Songhai control. Salt from Tagaza was essential to West African economies, and controlling its production gave Songhai enormous economic leverage. He pushed east into Hausaland, extending Songhai influence into what is now northern Nigeria. He campaigned in the west, consolidating control over territories that Mali had once ruled. By the peak of his reign, Songhai stretched from the Atlantic coast to the borders of modern Chad, from the Sahara to the forest fringe. This vast empire required military power to maintain. Askia Muhammad inherited Sunni Ali's formidable army and made it even more effective. The Songhai military was organized, disciplined, and professional. At its core was a cavalry force mounted on horses imported from North Africa, armored warriors who could charge with devastating effect. Supporting them was infantry armed with spears, swords, and bows, organized into units with specific tactical roles. And crucial to Songhai's power was its navy, war canoes that patrolled the Niger River, projecting power along its entire length. Military service in Songhai was not random conscription. It was organized by province and ethnic group. Different regions contributed different types of troops. Some areas provided cavalry, others provided infantry or boatmen. This system distributed the military burden across the empire, while allowing commanders to use troops in roles that matched their skills and culture. It also created ties of loyalty and shared purpose that helped hold the diverse empire together. The army was not just a fighting force, it was an instrument of imperial policy, a tool for collecting tribute, suppressing rebellions, and securing trade routes. Garrisons were stationed in key cities and along important routes. Provincial governors commanded local forces that could respond to threats quickly. And when major campaigns were necessary, the empire could mobilize tens of thousands of soldiers, a logistical achievement that required sophisticated planning and organization. But Askia Muhammad's genius was not limited to military and administrative matters. He understood the importance of justice and law in maintaining social cohesion. He appointed Islamic judges, qadis, to major cities and regions, giving them authority to adjudicate disputes according to Sharia law. This created a relatively consistent legal framework across the empire, reducing conflicts and facilitating commerce. At the same time, he allowed local customs and traditional authorities to continue functioning in areas where Islamic law had not fully penetrated, pragmatically balancing centralized authority with local autonomy. The result was an empire that, despite its vast size and ethnic diversity, functioned with remarkable efficiency. Caravans could travel from Timbuktu to Tagaza, from Gao to Jenne, with relative security. Merchants could expect contracts to be enforced. Scholars could pursue their studies without fear of arbitrary violence. Farmers could cultivate their fields knowing that the empire's armies would protect them from raiders. This stability, this predictability, was the foundation of Songhai's prosperity. But empires, no matter how well organized, are fragile. They depend on strong leadership, on institutions that survive individual rulers, on the ability to adapt to changing circumstances. And in Songhai's case, cracks were already beginning to appear, even during the golden age of Askia Muhammad's reign. The empire was enormous, perhaps too enormous to govern effectively with the technology and communication methods available in the 15th and 16th centuries. Messages from the capital to distant provinces took weeks or months. Rebellions could begin and gather strength before the central government even learned of them. Provincial governors, far from the emperor's watchful eye, could build their own power bases, become semi-independent rulers in all but name. The centrifugal forces of such a vast territory were always present, always threatening to pull the empire apart. Succession was another chronic problem. Askia Muhammad had created an administrative system, but he had not created a clear, stable system for transferring power. When he grew old and infirm, his sons began plotting against each other and against him. In 1528, his own son, Askia Musa, deposed him in a palace coup. The old emperor, blind and feeble, was forced into exile. He lived for 10 more years in humiliation, a tragic end for the man who had made Songhai great. The coup that removed Askia Muhammad set a dangerous precedent. Power could be seized through force and intrigue. The throne was not sacred or secure. Over the next several decades, Songhai witnessed a succession of short-reigned emperors, palace coups, civil conflicts, and murdered rulers. Between 1528 and 1588, Songhai had 9 different Askias. Some reigned for only months, most met violent ends. This instability did not immediately destroy the empire. The administrative structures Askia Muhammad had created continued to function. The economy remained prosperous, the military remained formidable. But the constant turnover of leadership, the perpetual scheming and violence at the top, weakened the empire's cohesion and its ability to respond to external threats. And external threats were coming. To the north, across the Sahara, a new power was rising that would prove to be Songhai's nemesis. Morocco, under the Saadi dynasty, had ambitions of its own. The Moroccan sultans looked south across the desert and saw wealth, gold, the legendary riches of West Africa. They saw an opportunity to control the trans-Saharan trade routes, to tap into the gold that flowed from the south. And they saw an empire, Songhai, that despite its size and reputation might be vulnerable. Morocco had advantages that Songhai could not match. It had access to firearms, muskets and arquebuses imported from Europe or manufactured in North African workshops. These weapons, primitive by later standards, were revolutionary in 16th century warfare. A soldier with a musket could kill an armored cavalryman at a distance, could stand against a charging warrior with a spear. Firearms were changing warfare across the world, making traditional cavalry and infantry tactics obsolete. And Songhai, for all its military sophistication, had not adopted firearms on any significant scale. The reasons for this were complex. Songhai's economy, despite its wealth, it was not based on industrial production. It had no gunpowder manufacturing capacity, no gunsmiths capable of producing firearms in quantity. Importing weapons from North Africa would have meant dealing with Moroccan merchants, potentially arming themselves against future Moroccan aggression. There was also cultural resistance. Songhai's military traditions were built around cavalry and close combat, around warriors whose prestige came from personal prowess and courage. Firearms, which allowed a common soldier to kill a noble warrior from a distance, seemed dishonorable, a coward's weapon. But honor and tradition do not stop bullets, and in 1590, Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur of Morocco decided that the time had come to seize control of the trans-Saharan trade. His target was the salt mines of Tagaza and ultimately the gold-producing regions controlled by Songhai. His weapon was a small but well-equipped army of about 4,000 men, many of them armed with muskets, commanded by a Spanish eunuch named Judah Pasha. The decision to invade was controversial even in Morocco. Crossing the Sahara with an army was a logistical nightmare. The desert was vast, waterless, and merciless. Caravans took months to make the crossing, following known routes from oasis to oasis. An army, moving slowly with weapons and supplies, would face even greater challenges. Many of al-Mansur's advisors argued against the expedition, warning that the desert itself might destroy the army before it ever reached Songhai. But the Sultan was determined. He believed that the rewards, the gold of West Africa, the control of trade routes, were worth the risks. Judah Pasha's army began its march in late 1590. The crossing of the Sahara was as difficult as predicted. Men died of thirst, supplies ran low, discipline frayed, but Judah Pasha, an experienced commander, pushed forward. And crucially, he had guides, Saharan nomads who knew the routes and oases, who kept the army from getting lost in the trackless wastes. After months of brutal marching, the Moroccan army emerged from the desert and approached the Niger River. In Songhai, the news of the Moroccan invasion caused alarm, but not panic. The ruling Askia Ishaq II, was confident. He commanded an army that vastly outnumbered the Moroccans. Songhai's military had a reputation built over a century of victories. The generals who advised the Askia believed that a swift, decisive battle would crush the invaders and send a message to Morocco that West Africa was not to be trifled with. They did not fully understand what they were facing. The two armies met at Tondibi, near the Niger River, in April 1591. The Songhai army was massive, perhaps 40,000 strong, including thousands of cavalry, the pride of Songhai military power. The Moroccan force was tiny in comparison, fewer than 4,000 men. But those men had muskets, artillery, and rigid discipline. They formed defensive positions, with musketeers protected by wagons and earthworks, artillery positioned to rake the battlefield. The Songhai cavalry charged. It was a magnificent sight, thousands of armored horsemen thundering across the plain, weapons glinting in the sun, the earth shaking beneath their hooves. They had won countless battles with such charges, breaking enemy lines through sheer momentum and ferocity. But at Tondibi, they charged into a hail of gunfire. Musket balls ripped through armor and flesh. Artillery shells exploded among the ranks, horses screamed and fell, men died by the hundreds. The charge faltered, broke, and retreated in confusion. The Songhai commanders tried again, throwing wave after wave of cavalry and infantry at the Moroccan positions. Each time, the result was the same. The disciplined Moroccan soldiers held their ground, reloaded their weapons and fired into the massed Songhai ranks. The battle was not close, it was a massacre. By the end of the day, thousands of Songhai soldiers lay dead or wounded on the field. The Moroccan army had suffered minimal casualties. Askia Ishaq II, in disbelief and despair, ordered a retreat. Tondibi was a catastrophe, a turning point not just for Songhai, but for West African history. In a single day, a century of military dominance, a carefully constructed empire, a civilization that had seemed unassailable, was shattered. The defeat was not just military, it was psychological, a demonstration that Songhai's traditional way of war, the cavalry charges, and massed infantry that had worked for generations, were obsolete in the face of firearms. After Tondibi, resistance crumbled. The Moroccan army advanced on Gao, the imperial capital. Askia Ishaq II fled. The city fell without a fight. The Moroccans then moved on Timbuktu, the jewel of the Sahel. Again, there was no effective resistance. The city surrendered. Judah Pasha's tiny army, battered by the Sahara crossing but victorious in battle, now controlled the major cities of the Songhai heartland. But controlling cities is not the same as controlling an empire. The Moroccans had won the battles, but they could not win the peace. They occupied Gao, Timbuktu and Jenne, but the vast countryside remained hostile. Songhai's provincial governors, military commanders and local chiefs did not accept Moroccan rule. They launched guerrilla campaigns, ambushing Moroccan patrols, cutting supply lines, making occupation costly and dangerous. The Niger River, which had been Songhai's highway of commerce and power, became a battleground. The Moroccans faced a problem that has plagued occupying armies throughout history. They could win battles, but they could not pacify a hostile population spread across an enormous territory. Sultan al-Mansur, thousands of miles away in Morocco, sent reinforcements and supplies. But the logistics were nightmarish. Everything had to be carried across the Sahara, a journey that took months and cost lives and resources. The Moroccan soldiers in West Africa, far from home, in a strange land with unfamiliar diseases and hostile people, suffered from low morale and high casualties. Moreover, the Moroccans failed to establish a functioning government to replace Songhai's administration. They appointed governors and tried to collect taxes, but they lacked the local knowledge, the networks of loyalty and obligation, the cultural understanding that had allowed Songhai's rulers to govern effectively. The result was chaos. Trade declined as merchants avoided routes plagued by conflict. Agricultural production fell as farmers fled or were conscripted. The cities that had prospered under Songhai rule became shadows of their former selves. In Timbuktu, the scholars who had made the city famous began to leave. Some fled to safer regions. Others were executed or imprisoned by the Moroccans, who distrusted the educated elite, fearing they might organize resistance. The great libraries, repositories of centuries of accumulated knowledge, were looted or destroyed. Manuscripts were burned, scattered, or carried away. The intellectual tradition that had flourished under Askia Muhammad's patronage withered. The golden age of learning ended not with a flourish but with slow, grinding decline. The Moroccan occupation created a power vacuum that no single authority could fill. The Songhai Empire, as a unified political entity, ceased to exist after Tondibi. But the idea of Songhai, the identity, the memory of greatness, persisted. Various claimants to the title of Askia emerged, each controlling a fragment of the former empire, each claiming to be the legitimate heir to Sunni Ali and Askia Muhammad. They fought each other as much as they fought the Moroccans, turning the Niger River valley into a patchwork of warring statelets. This fragmentation benefited only outsiders. The Moroccan garrison troops in Gao, Timbuktu and Jenne gradually lost contact with Morocco. Separated by thousands of miles of desert, receiving no reinforcements, marrying local women, they became a Creole military caste, the Ama, neither Moroccan nor Songhai, but something in between. They controlled the major cities for decades, extracting what wealth they could, but they never controlled the empire. They were occupiers without an occupation, conquerors without a conquest. The trans-Saharan trade, which had been Songhai's economic lifeblood, shifted. Merchants found new routes that avoided the conflict zones. Some trade continued, but the volume and value declined. The Moroccan sultans, who had invaded West Africa hoping to seize control of gold and salt, found that occupying territory did not translate into economic gain. The gold still flowed from the south, but now it flowed through routes they did not control, enriching other merchants, other kingdoms. And while Songhai collapsed and the Niger River Valley descended into chaos, the world was changing in ways that would make the region even more marginal to global affairs. European powers, having discovered the Americas and opened direct sea routes to Asia, were on the cusp of a new era. The Atlantic slave trade, which would devastate African societies for centuries, was expanding. European merchants were building forts on West Africa's coast, bypassing the trans-Saharan trade routes entirely. The Mediterranean and Saharan world, which had been central to global commerce for millennia, was becoming a backwater. Songhai's fall was not just a local disaster, it was a symbolic moment, the end of an era when West African empires were powerful, wealthy, and sophisticated participants in global networks of trade and culture. After Songhai, no West African state would match its size, power, or influence until the era of modern nation-states. The region fragmented into smaller kingdoms and chiefdoms, more vulnerable to external pressures, less able to resist the encroachments of European colonial powers. The question that haunts historians is, could Songhai have survived? Were there decisions, reforms, adaptations that might have allowed the empire to meet the Moroccan challenge? The answer is complex. Songhai's failure to adopt firearms was certainly a critical mistake, but it was not simply a matter of military technology. It was about economic structure, about industrial capacity, about access to resources and knowledge. Songhai was wealthy, but its wealth was based on commerce and agriculture, not on the kind of manufacturing base that could produce firearms. Even more fundamentally, Songhai's size and administrative structure made it vulnerable to succession crises and regional fragmentation. The empire was held together by the personal authority of strong rulers like Sunni Ali and Askia Muhammad. When leadership faltered, when the throne became a prize to be seized through violence, the empire's cohesion weakened. Perhaps a more institutionalized system of governance, less dependent on individual rulers, might have provided greater stability. But creating such institutions in a pre-modern agrarian society was extraordinarily difficult. There is also the matter of geography and environment. Songhai was vast, stretching across ecological zones from desert to savanna to forest fringe. Governing such diversity was challenging even in the best of times. Communication was slow. Regional identities were strong. Ethnic and linguistic differences created friction. The empire was always, to some degree, held together by force and self-interest rather than by genuine political unity. When military defeat undermined the perception of Songhai's invincibility, those centrifugal forces reasserted themselves with devastating speed. Yet for all that, Songhai's achievements were extraordinary. At its height, it was one of the largest empires in the world, comparable in size to contemporary European states. Its economy was sophisticated, integrated into global trade networks. Its cities were centers of learning that rivaled anything in Europe or the Middle East. Its government, despite its flaws, was more organized and effective than most of the kingdoms that surrounded it. And it accomplished all of this in an era when Africa was supposedly primitive, uncivilized, lacking in history or culture. This is the cruel irony of Songhai's story. Its fall coincided with the beginning of European expansion into Africa, with the rise of racist ideologies that justified colonialism and slavery by claiming that Africans were inherently inferior, incapable of building great civilizations. The ruins of Songhai, the abandoned cities, the collapsed trade networks, the political fragmentation, were used as evidence of African backwardness, as proof that Europeans needed to bring civilization to the so-called Dark Continent. But the truth was the opposite. Songhai's ruins were not evidence of African inability to build great civilizations. They were evidence of what Africans had built, of the sophistication and power that had existed before European intervention. The fall of Songhai was not inevitable, not the natural result of some inherent African weakness. It was the result of specific historical circumstances, technological change, geopolitical shifts, bad leadership at critical moments, and ultimately external invasion. The legacy of Songhai persists, though often unrecognized. In the Niger River Valley, oral traditions still recount the deeds of Sunni Ali and Askia Muhammad. In Timbuktu, scholars still study manuscripts that survived the chaos of the Moroccan occupation, documents that prove the city's intellectual heritage. In museums and archives from Mali to Morocco to Europe, artifacts and records testify to Songhai's greatness. And in the growing field of African history, scholars are recovering and reconstructing the story of Songhai, challenging old narratives, and restoring this empire to its rightful place in world history. Understanding Songhai matters because it challenges fundamental assumptions about Africa's past. It forces us to reckon with the reality that sophisticated, powerful civilizations existed in Africa long before European contact. It demonstrates that African history is not a footnote to European history, but a rich, complex, essential part of human history. And it reminds us that the narratives we have been taught, the stories of African primitiveness and European superiority, are not truth, but ideology, constructions designed to justify exploitation and domination. Songhai also offers lessons about power, empire, and the fragility of even the greatest states. It shows how empires rise through vision, organization, and military effectiveness. It shows how they prosper through economic integration, legal frameworks, and cultural achievements. And it shows how they fall through leadership failures, technological stagnation, succession crises, and external threats. These are patterns that recur throughout history, from Rome to Mali to the British Empire. Songhai's story is not unique, but it is instructive. For the people of West Africa, Songhai represents a source of pride and identity. It is a reminder that their ancestors built great things, that they were not passive victims of history, but active agents who shaped their world. In an era when African history is still often marginalized or distorted, when African contributions to civilization are still often ignored, reclaiming and celebrating Songhai's legacy is an act of cultural and historical justice. The physical remnants of Songhai are few. Gao, once a great capital, is now a modest city in Mali, its ancient structures mostly eroded by time. Timbuktu still exists, a shadow of its former glory, its famous mosques and libraries struggling against poverty and conflict. Jenne's Great Mosque, rebuilt in later centuries, remains a monument to West African architectural achievement, but it is not the city that Sunni Ali besieged. The empire's palaces, its marketplaces, its administrative buildings have mostly vanished, reclaimed by the desert and the river. But the manuscripts survive. In Timbuktu and other cities, in private collections and public archives, hundreds of thousands of manuscripts dating to the Songhai era and earlier are being preserved, digitized, and studied. These documents, written in Arabic and local languages, cover every conceivable subject: Islamic law and theology, mathematics and astronomy, medicine and pharmacology, history and literature, commercial contracts and personal correspondence. They are a window into the intellectual life of Songhai, proof of a sophisticated, literate culture engaged with the broader Islamic world. The manuscripts reveal a society that was far more complex than the simplistic narratives of African history allow. They show scholars debating fine points of Islamic jurisprudence, astronomers calculating planetary motions, doctors describing treatments for diseases, merchants recording transactions. They show a cosmopolitan world where ideas flowed freely, where West Africans were not isolated primitives but active participants in global intellectual networks. And they show that the knowledge and learning that flourished under Songhai's patronage were real, substantial, and sophisticated. Efforts to preserve these manuscripts are ongoing and urgent. Many are in fragile condition, threatened by climate, insects, neglect, and conflict. When Islamist militants occupied Timbuktu in 2012, they burned some manuscripts and damaged others, acts of cultural vandalism that shocked the world. But local scholars and families, at great risk to themselves, smuggled many manuscripts to safety, hiding them in remote villages or transporting them to the capital, Bamako. Their bravery ensured that this invaluable heritage survived. International organizations and scholars are now working to digitize, translate, and study these manuscripts, making them accessible to researchers and the public. This work is recovering lost knowledge, reconstructing the intellectual history of West Africa, and challenging long-held assumptions about the region's past. It is a slow process, requiring expertise in Arabic, in West African languages, in Islamic studies, in paleography and conservation. But it is essential work, restoring voices that were silenced, histories that were erased. Songhai's story is also a story about memory and forgetting, about who gets to write history and whose history is valued. For centuries, European colonial historians dismissed or ignored African achievements, constructing a narrative of African history that began with European contact, as if nothing of importance had happened before. Empires like Songhai were unknown or treated as curiosities, footnotes in a history focused on Europe and the Mediterranean. This erasure was not accidental. It served colonial interests to portray Africa as a blank slate, a place without history or civilization, a place that needed European intervention to enter history. If Africans had built great empires, if they had sophisticated governments and economies, if they had intellectual and artistic achievements, then the moral justification for colonialism collapsed. So Songhai and other African empires were written out of history, or their significance was minimized. Decolonizing history means recovering these stories, taking them seriously, studying them with the same rigor and respect given to European or Asian history. It means recognizing that Songhai was not just a curiosity, but a major power, that its achievements were real and significant, that its story is part of world history. And it means asking why these stories were suppressed, who benefited from their suppression, and what other histories have been similarly marginalized. For modern West Africa, Songhai is both an inspiration and challenge. It is inspirational because it proves that West Africans built great things, that they have a history of achievement and sophistication. It is a source of pride, a counter-narrative to the demeaning stereotypes that still circulate. But it is also a challenge, because the region today struggles with poverty, conflict, and underdevelopment. How does a society reconcile a glorious past with a difficult present? How does it draw strength from history without becoming trapped in nostalgia? These are questions that many post-colonial societies face. The fall of Songhai was followed by centuries of disruption. The Atlantic slave trade, which depopulated regions and destroyed social structures. Colonialism, which imposed arbitrary borders and extracted resources. And post-colonial instability, which has left many West African countries struggling to build functioning states. The weight of this history is heavy, and it would be naive to suggest that simply celebrating Songhai's past can solve contemporary problems. But history matters. It shapes identity, provides context, and offers lessons. Understanding that West Africa was once home to powerful, sophisticated empires changes how people see themselves and their potential. It challenges the internalized racism that colonialism and slavery left behind, the insidious belief that Africans are somehow less capable, less deserving. It provides a foundation for building a different future, one rooted in pride and possibility rather than shame and limitation. Songhai's rise and fall also offers practical lessons. The importance of strong, stable institutions that can survive individual leaders. The need to adapt to technological and economic change. The danger of succession crises and internal conflict. The value of education, learning, and intellectual life in sustaining a civilization. The necessity of economic diversification and resilience. These are not abstract lessons. They are relevant to contemporary governance, to building states that can endure. The story of Songhai is ultimately a human story. It is about people who dreamed of building something great and succeeded. It is about leaders who were brilliant and flawed, visionary and ruthless. It is about scholars who pursued knowledge, soldiers who fought for their empire, merchants who built networks of trade, farmers who fed cities. It is about ordinary people living through extraordinary times, times of prosperity and war, of triumph and catastrophe. When Sunni Ali rode out of Gao to conquer Timbuktu, when Askia Muhammad set out on his pilgrimage to Mecca, when Songhai's soldiers charged the Moroccan guns at Tondibi, they were acting in specific historical moments, responding to specific challenges and opportunities. They could not have foreseen the long-term consequences of their actions. They could not have known that historians centuries later would study their deeds, debate their decisions, and draw lessons from their successes and failures. This is the nature of history. We are all acting in the present, making decisions with incomplete information, shaped by the cultures and constraints of our time. Only in retrospect, with the clarity of distance, can we see patterns, trace causes and effects, and understand significance. The people of Songhai lived their lives, built their empire, and watched it fall, without knowing they were part of a story that would be told for centuries. But that story deserves to be told, and told well. It deserves to be freed from the distortions of colonial ideology, from the silences and erasures that have hidden it for so long. It deserves to be understood in all its complexity, the brilliance and the brutality, the achievements and the failures, the glory and the tragedy. Because Songhai was not a myth or a fantasy. It was real, it happened, and it mattered. The Niger River still flows through West Africa, the same river that was Songhai's highway, that carried trade and armies, that sustained cities and empires. The salt mines of the Sahara still produce salt, though the caravans that once carried it south are fewer and smaller. The gold fields still yield gold, though the routes and markets have changed. And in the cities and villages along the Niger, people still tell stories of Sunni Ali and Askia Muhammad, of the time when their ancestors ruled an empire that stretched across the Sahel. These stories are not nostalgia for a lost golden age. They are a reminder of what was, and by extension, what could be. They are a challenge to the present, a call to remember that greatness is possible, that Africans have built civilizations before and can build them again. They are a link between past and future, between the empire that fell 500 years ago and the nations that struggle today to find their place in a complex, globalized world. Songhai fell, but its legacy endures. In the manuscripts of Timbuktu, in the oral traditions of the Niger Valley, in the work of historians recovering suppressed histories, in the pride of people who claim descent from this great empire. It endures as a testament to what Africans achieved, to the sophistication and power of pre-colonial African states, to the richness and complexity of African history. And it endures as a warning. Empires, no matter how powerful, are fragile. They require constant effort to maintain, constant adaptation to survive. They are vulnerable to internal division, to succession crises, to technological change, to external threats. The story of Songhai, like the story of Rome or Mali or countless other empires, is a reminder that nothing lasts forever, that glory is fleeting, that even the mightiest fall. But before they fall, they achieve things worth remembering. Songhai created a political order that brought peace and prosperity to millions. It facilitated trade networks that connected West Africa to the Mediterranean and beyond. It patronized learning that enriched Islamic civilization. It built cities that were centers of culture and commerce. It demonstrated that Africans could create large, complex, sophisticated states that rivaled anything in the world. For 2 centuries, Songhai stood as a testament to African achievement, a proof that the continent was not primitive or backward, but dynamic and advanced. Its scholars were respected across the Islamic world. Its armies were feared. Its merchants were wealthy. Its cities were centers of learning and culture. This was not a myth. This was history. This was real. And then it ended. The armies were defeated. The cities were occupied, the empire fragmented, the golden age passed into memory. But memory matters, history matters. The story of Songhai matters because it is part of the larger story of humanity, of our capacity to build and destroy, to create and lose, to achieve greatness and watch it crumble. In the end, Songhai's rise and fall reminds us that history is not inevitable, that outcomes are not predetermined, that human choices and actions shape the world. Sunni Ali chose to build an empire. Askia Muhammad chose to patronize learning and embrace Islam. Askia Ishaq chose to meet the Moroccans in open battle rather than wage guerrilla war. Each choice had consequences, some intended, some not. The legacy of those choices, of those centuries of achievement and ambition, is what we remember today. We remember Songhai not because it lasted forever, but because it was great. We remember it not to mourn what was lost, but to celebrate what was achieved. We remember it because its story, epic and tragic, Triumphant and cautionary, is a story worth telling, worth knowing, worth honoring. The Songhai Empire rose from the banks of the Niger River, built by vision and conquest, sustained by trade and learning, and ultimately destroyed by internal weakness and external invasion. But in its centuries of existence, it proved what Africans could accomplish, what they had accomplished, what the world has too long forgotten or ignored. This is the story that deserves to be remembered. This is the history that must be told.